This is The Future Of, where experts share their vision of the future and how their work is helping shape it for the better.
I'm David Blaney. In the past few years, there's been a steady decrease in the percentage of Australians choosing to own their own home, and an increase in the percentage of those choosing to rent. Those numbers, coupled with fluctuating property prices, has left the future of home ownership in uncertainty. To discuss this topic further, with me today are two guests, Associate Professor Steven Rowley, who is the Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute's Curtin Research Centre, and Dr Amity James, a Senior Lecturer within Curtin University's School of Economics, Finance and Property. Thank you very much both for coming in today.
Thank you for having us.
Will the great Australian dream as such was once to own a quarter-acre block, I guess, apparently. Is this still going to be the dream in the future?
Well, I think for young people, the dream is just owning anything. The quarter-acre block is long dead, I believe, but for young people, that ownership dream is still there. Because ownership provides a sense of security, and we've got quite an uncertain labour market now, precarious employment, people doing perhaps multiple jobs moving forward. So actually owning a home gives you some stability in your life. So we've done quite a lot of work. We've recently published a piece of work on the housing aspirations of young Australians, and that aspiration to own a home is still very much there. The issue, of course, is being able to afford home ownership, with prices becoming increasingly out of reach because prices have increased much quicker than incomes. It's very tough for young people to get into home ownership, and saving that deposit is very difficult as well, particularly if you're in an expensive rental market. So it is becoming more and more difficult for young people to break into home ownership, but I think the desire is still there.
And Amity, owning a home can also provide you a bit of security later in life as well when you retire.
Yeah, absolutely. Older people do have a desire for home ownership, so even perhaps those who are looking at downsizing still want to retain ownership. So if they own their own home and have done for a number of years, what they want to do is to be able to buy another property. So if they are looking to downsize, and that's their aspiration, one of the things they would like to do is own their property. Now, it might not be the quarter-acre block. They are certainly not looking for small houses though, so the dwelling size will remain at least around the 3-bedroom mark. So people do want to get home ownership of a larger property, because when we often think of downsizing, we think of people who are moving into much smaller dwellings, perhaps units as well.
And ownership's not just about financial gain. People think, property and housing is all about money, but that's not what motivates people for ownership. It is a place to call home. It's a place to bring up your children or just have pets. And again, it comes back to that security, safety and security. So a lot of sort of psychological drivers of home ownership, much more so actually than financial. When we talk about financial, that's really one of the main issues why we have an affordability problem when you've got that investment demand, and that's really sort of pushed up prices. So if you didn't have that layer of investment demand pushing up demand and so forth, then ownership would be a lot more affordable.
And not to mention, with respect to security, it's not just, it's not just about financial security. It's also when you rent a property, you're not afforded the same protections that, of course, you do have if you own your own home.
Absolutely, yeah, you're very right there. You're at the whim of the private rental market, so that you have to sort of go with the ebbs and flows of the private rental market. So people are often forced to move. We find private renters are forced to move much more often than homeowners are. So we've got, particularly with the older cohort, we've got a lot of people who are in the private rental market not by choice, and they're not afforded that security of tenure. So their house prices can increase, so the rents that they're paying can increase, but perhaps not at the same rate of the pension that they're receiving.
I mean, you mentioned in your introduction that people were choosing to go into private rental market. It's not a choice for many people. It's because they have absolutely no other option. And so when we've asked renters about their motivations, quite often it's like, I had no other option. Public housing, social housing not available. private home ownership is well out of the reach, so the private rental market is the only thing that's available. So we definitely need some major reform in that private rental market to get the sort of conditions that they have in other countries that will allow you to stay there for a longer period of time, have that sort of security, and again have a really sort of sustainable alternative to home ownership.
Because ultimately it's not very, while on the one hand you have a degree of flexibility when you're renting, because you can choose to move with a much shorter, well, much easier to move than if you own the house, but you also have no grounds eviction notices, for example. We're one of the few countries which has this.
Well, one of the few states now, and there is ongoing reform to remove no grounds eviction. Which on the surface sounds like a no-brainer, really. But from a landlord's point of view, it does reduce your options. So there are two sides to private rental reforms, but we certainly haven't got it right at the moment. And certainly the Victorian government has been through some significant reforms. WA is going through consultation around private rental reform as well. So I think we will get to a point where the private rental sector is a viable longer-term alternative, but we're quite a way away from that yet.
Housing prices have gone up quite a bit over recent years. Can this keep going? Is it going to keep going?
Well, it's not quite true. Prices haven't risen in Western Australia for about 5 years now. Other parts of the country, like Sydney, well, prices have come down for a 2-year period, but went up very quickly before that and have started to rise again. So there's a tremendous amount of variation across the country. But the general trend outside Western Australia over the last 10 years has been significant price rises. And as I mentioned before, if prices rise quicker than income, housing becomes less and less affordable, more and more difficult for people to get into home ownership. So what happened in Sydney and Melbourne in particular, there were changes to the rules around lending, made it more difficult for people to borrow money, so demand dropped off and prices started to fall. Those rules have been relaxed somewhat now. Interest rates have come down even further, so now there's a little bit of a rush back into those markets and prices have started going up again. In Western Australia, so prices are roughly the same level as they were in about 2007, something like that, but have come down significantly since about 2013, 14. No real signs that any major shifts in price, and that's been a result of a fairly weak economy. You haven't had that level of demand, and we built an awful lot of houses in that well, probably in the 10 years up to about 2016. So we had an awful lot of supply, and now demand has dropped off, so prices have come down. So it's made the market much more affordable.
Home ownership has dropped, in the past 20 years, it's dropped by about 4%. Is this that significant of a number?
Well, I'll give you some figures because there's a lot of variability around home ownership. You're right, it has trended down over the last period. So home ownership rates are about 80% for those over 55. So very strong ownership rates. The 20% will either be in the private rental market or social housing. And it's about 70% for those in the age bracket 45 to 54, but that's fallen by about 10% in the last 25 years. So we've seen a big drop in that 45 to 54 category. For those 35 to 44, the ownership rate is about 60%, and that's down from 75% in 1981. So big drop there. For 25 to 34-year-olds, it's fallen from 60% to 45% in the last 25 years. So we've seen big drops there. And if that trend continues, it's probably less than a third of 25 to 34-year-olds that are owning a home by about 2030. So we have seen significant drops, but in that younger age category, it's still high by international standards. So in that age bracket, certainly higher than the US, for example, similar to Canada, and certainly higher than a lot of Europe. So home ownership rents are certainly trending down, but still quite high by international standards. But if we do continue in this current trend, the situation is going to look completely different in 20 years' time.
Why is that? Why is it higher in Australia compared to our international peers?
Well, I think it's historical. We had a period where people had fairly cheap access to housing. It's only in the last 30 years that house prices have really taken off in comparison to incomes, and there's always been that sort of culture, a home owning type of culture, whereas other parts of Europe don't have that same owning culture. They have a private rental market that allows for longer term private rental tenancies, and yeah, I say people expect it. Society expects you to own your home. We've got a whole superannuation system built around owning outright in retirement. So it's very much as it has been, as the parents owned and their parents owned and so forth. So it's a cultural norm.
And I think that as it starts to fall, it's not necessarily out of choice. So as we said earlier, there are cohorts that are unable to access that home ownership market, or indeed falling out of home ownership as well. So we've got people who are perhaps a couple who are married, family household, there's a separation, they have to sell the family home, the asset, and as a result of that, they're unable to access home ownership from the proceeds of the sale of that home. That means that those two new formed households are falling out of home ownership, and often females who quite often also look after the children are unable to re-enter that home ownership market. So we really see that it's trending down, but it's not necessarily by choice either.
And it's a really important point. We think people get into home ownership and that's it, they stay there forever. That's not the case at all. We did a bit of research on older renters and found probably about 2/3 of older renters, half to 2/3, had actually been in home ownership but have fallen out of home ownership and into the private rental market. So just because you get in home ownership doesn't mean that's your tenure for life. There's a lot of churn in and out, and there's not a tremendous amount of support to keep people in home ownership who have no other options. There's not really a safety net. The private rental market's not a very good safety net at all. It's very expensive, and we don't have much public housing or community housing. So if you lose your home through financial reasons, marriage breakup, ill health, there's really not too many options out there. So it's a really big problem for government moving forward, and one that requires some significant attention.
With older Australians being pushed onto the private rental market, what does this mean for the pension system?
I think, in short, the pension was never designed to be able to cover the housing costs of a household. So the assumption is that as you enter retirement, you have paid off your home and those costs no longer exist. So the pension just doesn't cover those, or doesn't enable those people, older people in the private rental sector, to make ends meet. So they might be able to access Commonwealth rent assistance, and that will go towards their rent. But even then, those two payments combined really don't make ends meet. It's still a real struggle to make those weekly payments.
And it bleeds out your superannuation a lot faster than it would otherwise.
Absolutely. People are drawing on their savings for all sorts of things. So if there's a health scare, or there's a downturn in people's health, we've seen people be forced out of their dwellings into share houses. So at the age of, say, 65, 70, moving into a share house because they simply can't afford to pay for the rent of their own home anymore.
A consequence of these declining home ownership rates in the earlier age groups means there'll be a lot less home ownership in those older groups in sort of 20, 30, 40 years' time. So it's a growing problem. And so, as I said before, government needs to do something or the housing system needs to be reshaped. So there are options for the quite large proportions of people that will not own into retirement moving forward.
And the government is they're certainly trying to intervene to an extent. We've got the superannuation saving, the first home superannuation saving scheme, where you can use, you can add more money to your super, get those tax benefits and use that to save for your first home. Could you tell us more about the first home loan deposit scheme? This is the new program, which I think it guarantees a proportion of your deposit.
That's right. This is to come in next year. So there are eligibility criteria. So those earning under 125,000 or couples up to 200,000 can apply to the scheme. Under the scheme, the household will have to put forward 5% of the deposit, and the government will guarantee the other 15%, and they won't have to pay mortgage insurance either. But the the threshold of the dwellings that they can purchase is around 400,000. So in Western Australia, sorry. So in Western Australia, you can borrow up to or purchase a dwelling up to $400,000, which really doesn't give you a great deal of choice in the Greater Perth area. So you'll see that just a quick look at a
Two by one, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess it will depend on where you're purchasing.
You get quite a lot in Perth now for 400,000. It's 700,000 in. It's very much a policy designed for the East Coast. We've had a similar scheme in Perth for over 20 years.
Yes,
Keystart, which is a 2% deposit requirement, and that's housed tens of thousands of people over the years. So there's 10,000 of these first home, the guarantees available, which is about 1 in 10 first home buyers would get access to it. And so the vast majority will be on the East Coast, and it will provide some benefit, but these are people that would have already bought. It will probably bring forward their home owning decision, but I don't think it will help anybody into home ownership that wouldn't already have been able to make it at some point over the next few years.
And why is that?
Well, people that are able to save for a deposit are the ones that are going to make it into home ownership. So you still got to have a 5% deposit. The 5% of 700,000 is still a fair amount. So you've got to have that discipline to be able to save or have the bank of mum and dad to help you. So again, it's not going to allow people on low income with no capacity to save get into home ownership. It will help people on moderate incomes who have the capacity to save decent incomes get in. And this is all going to be driven by major banks as well. So they'll ultimately make the decision on whether somebody has the capacity to pay back the loan or so forth. So again, I don't think it's going to make a massive difference to first home buyers. Everything helps, and maybe at the margins somebody who would have had to wait another 5 years will get in earlier, but it's not going to make a massive amount of difference.
Could this push housing prices up, as some critics have suggested?
No, too small.
No, easy. Is this the right way forward, these deposit guaranteeing schemes, or does the government need to do more does there need to be more intervention to make housing more affordable?
Well, you could argue there needs to be less intervention, particularly on the taxation side of things. The problem we have is, of course, it's an attractive investment asset. You have negative gearing, you have capital gains tax discount, so it makes it very attractive for people to invest in property. And of course, once you increase the layer of demand in property, that prices go up. So if you didn't have that, if it wasn't such an attractive investment asset, there'd be less demand there'd be less competition for ownership. Therefore, there would be, it'd be easier for first home buyers to get in. And we've also got an inefficient market with stamp duty and so forth. I mean, people don't want to move, they stay in their house because if you're going to move, it costs you an extra 30,000, 40,000, makes the market inefficient. So you've got people who are in homes that are perhaps not appropriately sized for them, don't want to move out because of the cost, so you don't get that efficient market process. So there are a number of things the government could do, but politically, the last thing the government wants to do is create a policy that's just going to bring down house prices, because all those voters will not be particularly happy with a government or a party that's basing a policy on reducing their wealth.
As we learned last election.
Well, yeah, that did not help Labor at all, unfortunately. I mean, the policy is reasonably sensible. But yeah, I mean, people thought, well, this is going to have an impact or could have an impact on my wealth, my well-being, so we're not going to vote for Labor.
So Amity, it's been less a matter of perhaps not enough intervention, but maybe the wrong kind of intervention.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I agree completely with it. I guess we also see, particularly I can talk about the downsizing of older Australians. We see the treatment of the family home and also things like stamp duty stopping people deciding to move, perhaps deciding to downsize, and then that then affects the flow of properties onto the market. So again, as Stephen said, it's too much intervention there.
Because if you sell a home, that means that you get means tested out of the age pension a bit.
That's right, yes. So particularly for those people who are on a part pension or on the borderline, it's going to be a really big part of their decision-making process. And often they decide to stay still because it's just not financially worthwhile. And although that's not the primary thing that's driving them, it can be enough to just put the brakes on that decision.
How are we faring when it comes to social housing? We don't seem to do as well as countries like England, for example, when it comes to housing stock for people who on low income or on benefits.
No, we're hopeless. Our levels of public housing are around 4.5%, 5%, tiny. At one point, I think in Scotland, it was 35, 40, 50%, but the UK is much, much higher. So we have a dire shortage of public and community housing in this country. It means you do not have that safety net. It means people are forced into an expensive private rental market. Therefore, they're forced into conditions of poverty when they're paying so much of their rent in, or so much of their income in rent. So, look, the government certainly could be directing more funds into delivering more affordable housing products, which includes public housing, but also subsidised rental markets as well, and we don't do very well on that. If the government wanted certainly to ease housing affordability crisis, it could intervene a lot more in terms of the direct provision of affordable housing. It could also encourage the private sector through incentives or through, quite frankly, taxation of land value uplift to deliver affordable housing as part of market development. So there are a number of things that could be done, but again, it's very expensive to deliver housing, and that's why state governments and certainly the federal government always been reluctant to go on mass, public housing building programs. It's very expensive to not only build, but the maintenance, the running costs are extremely expensive as well going forward.
Do you see the future of home ownership itself changing? Are people going to be living? You mentioned that the acreage is, well, it's just not really realistic anymore. Are we going to be living in smaller houses, more vertical communities, battling with strata, more shared spaces, that sort of thing?
I think we will be, but I don't think it'll be battling with shared spaces. I think that in some parts of the community there's quite a demand for new housing types that we don't already have in Western Australia or in Australia really. People are looking for spaces where they can potentially be closer to the city, which means that the land size that they're going to be on is going to be smaller, but that's not necessarily such a bad thing. People are happy to be in duplexes in smaller dwellings because they're going to have access to resources, they're going to have access to public open space and other amenities, which is going to offset the fact that they don't have that larger block that has sort of been demanded in the past.
Density doesn't need to be bad if it's well designed and so forth. People are happy living there, and we've seen a massive change, I think, in the aspirations of people. They just want to own something. If it happens to be a smaller dwelling, well, so be it. And say the shift has moved. There has been a shift away from large sprawling dwellings with big backyards towards just something smaller that people can manage, but ultimately allows them into home ownership. So we will see, and population growth is a key driver of this, and the lack of land. We will see a big change in the patterns of development. I mean, already in Sydney they build more apartments than they do houses. We're sort of 75-25 here, probably 80-20. So we've got a big way to go in Perth to change our housing structure and to increase housing diversity. But there's a big push from government and from the housing sector to change the way that we deliver housing, change the type of housing. We see metro hubs and MetroNet. We'll see more intense development around there. So we will see a shift over time, and I think you'll see in 30, 40 years' time, a lot of people in Perth will be living rather differently and getting used to high density living really quite quickly, because it's not the bad thing everybody makes out, unless it's badly designed and it's cracking and falling down. You can get really high quality medium and high density solutions, and that's what we need to be pushing forward in Perth and beyond.
And I think that until the private rental sector really starts to provide a place that people can call a home of their own and provide them with that security, there'll always be that drive for home ownership and that desire or aspiration for home ownership.
So it's not so much younger Australians being less interested in owning a home, it's more that they're sort of being pushed out of the market by just the sheer cost of it. Is this going to continue for future generations, for the people who who are, well, younger than me, I guess?
Well, it will if we don't have some major changes. So if we carry on as we are, housing will get increasingly expensive because there will still be, we've got population growth, we've got pressures there, you've got a layer of demand from investors. House prices will still continue to go up quicker than income. So it will become more and more difficult for young people to get into the market. So unless we see a major shift in the structure of the housing market, things are only going to get worse. We're not going to see major shifts in government policy around house building, direct provision. We might see a bit of build to rent, so more sort of institutional investment in the rental sector, but it's not going to make a massive difference. So yeah, unless there is a really significant shift in the way the housing market works and the way that government and industry work, we're going to see problems getting worse and worse.
And do you see any positive signs for change in the future? Any signs that things will improve, that the right policies will be implemented, that the right decisions will be made?
I think the housing industry gets a tough ride, really, but they are very cognizant of the issues around housing affordability and the pressures placed on young people and old people alike. So they want to offer solutions, and I know people will say, well, they're interested in the high density stuff because you make more money out of it, and well, there's a certain amount of that and more yield out of a site, but they are, as I say, interested in delivering solutions. Government, it depends on the election cycle. Housing affordability was way up the list of priorities a few years ago. It's dropped off again now because prices came down in Sydney and Melbourne. It will be back on again soon if prices continue to rise. But I think once we get a shift in the proportion of owners compared to the proportion of renters, suddenly you're going to get housing really high on that political agenda, actually making a shift to try and bring down prices. When you've got more voters that live in rental accommodation than actually own, it becomes politically prudent to do something about house prices. So I think we will see a big shift moving forward, but ultimately people will change the way that they live. Young people are already changing the way they live. There'll be more shared sort of ownership, so people buying things together, more shared spaces. So you might have a large house, but it's split up into multiple occupation. The market is clever, and the market adapts. Certainly the sharing economy will come to housing. It already has to a certain extent. People will get together and do developments. So yeah, people will find a way, but the traditional form of ownership, I think, will look rather different in 50 years' time for the people that are born in the next sort of 30 years or so.
I think we have to be open to this innovation in terms of tenure and diversity of dwelling types. The demand is certainly out there at the moment. People are coming up with new ideas and looking at ways to implement them. So it will definitely change. The scenario will definitely change. But being open to that innovation, I think, is part of seeing that exciting future in.
Okay, well, I think we'll wrap things up there. Thank you very much, Steven and Amity, for joining us and for sharing your knowledge on this topic.
Thanks for having us.
You've been listening to The Future Of, a podcast powered by Curtin University. If you have any questions about today's topic, get in touch by following the links in our show notes. Bye for now.